Have you ever looked into a mirror and felt like something was wrong? Like your reflection wasn't quite you? Like something or someone was standing behind you, waiting for you to notice? Tonight, I'll tell you a story of a woman who found herself trapped by the one thing she thought she could trust: her own reflection. It started innocently enough, with a move into a new apartment, but soon, every night became a nightmare. A nightmare that would leave her questioning her own sanity. So stay with me and keep your eyes on your reflection, because what you see might not be what you think. It was a fresh start for Sarah, a 27-year-old woman who had just landed her dream job in the city. She had spent weeks looking for the perfect apartment, somewhere peaceful, with enough charm to make her feel at home. And when she found it, she knew it was meant to be. Her new apartment was in an old building, located on the quieter side of the city, the kind of place that felt cozy and intimate, with hardwood floors that creaked underfoot and tall windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. Everything about it was perfect, except for one thing: an old ornate mirror, framed in dark, intricate wood, hung above the fireplace in the living room. At first glance, it seemed like just another antique piece, something that belonged to another time. But Sarah didn't think much of it. After all, it was just a mirror, right? But something inside her couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching her. The first night she stayed in the apartment, after she had unpacked everything, Sarah decided to relax. She made herself a cup of tea, put on some soft music, and settled down in her favorite armchair. She couldn't help but notice the mirror. It hung there, almost too still, too quiet. Sarah glanced at her reflection. She smiled, watching herself as she took a sip of tea. But for a moment, just a moment, her reflection didn't smile back. It remained expressionless, staring at her with cold, lifeless eyes. She blinked. Then the reflection returned to normal. But something stirred inside Sarah. Was it a trick of the light? Or had she imagined it? The next few nights were uneventful, at least at first. Sarah went about her life, unpacking, decorating, getting used to the apartment. She'd occasionally glance at the mirror, always feeling that strange sense of unease. But the reflection was always the same. Until it wasn't. It started small. One night, after a long day at work, Sarah sat down in front of the mirror, adjusting her hair as she prepared for bed. But when she looked up, she saw something that wasn't there before. A shadow. A tall, dark figure standing right behind her reflection. Sarah froze. Her pulse quickened. She slowly turned her head, but the room behind her was empty. There was no one there. Just the same quiet, empty apartment. She quickly turned back to the mirror, hoping it was just a trick of her tired eyes. But the figure remained. It was standing there, behind her, watching her. Still, she told herself it was just the light, the shadows, the old glass playing tricks on her. But each night, the figure grew clearer. At first, it was just a shadow, but soon it became something more. A man, tall and thin, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned suit, his face obscured by darkness. The thing that terrified Sarah wasn't just the figure. It was the feeling that she wasn't alone. That somehow he could see her, feel her, even though she couldn't see him. And then, one night, as Sarah stared at her reflection in the mirror, the figure smiled. A cold, wicked smile that stretched unnaturally wide. And Sarah's reflection smiled back. The nights that followed were filled with dread. Every time Sarah looked into the mirror, the figure was there, getting closer, his features becoming more defined. He was no longer a shadow now, he had a face. but it was the face of someone she didn't recognize. A man with hollow eyes, pale skin, and a smile that never seemed to end. She tried to avoid the mirror, but it was impossible. It was everywhere at the end of the hallway, in the reflection of every window, the glass that surrounded her. It followed her. And then, on the night of the full moon, something unimaginable happened. Sarah awoke to the sound of her own voice, her reflection calling to her. "Sarah, come closer." Her heart raced. She couldn't move, but somehow she found herself drawn to the mirror. She slowly stepped towards it, her legs heavy, as if the mirror was pulling her in. The reflection of her own face twisted into a grin, a sinister expression that made her skin crawl. Then, the figure behind her spoke. "I've been waiting for you." Terrified, Sarah screamed, but the sound was muffled. The reflection in the mirror. It was no longer her. Her reflection, now distorted and menacing, grinned wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. The figure in the background, it wasn't just a man anymore. It was something darker, something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. And then it spoke again, only this time. Its voice echoed through the walls of the apartment. The voice didn't just come from the mirror. It was all around her. "You're mine now, forever." With one final scream, Sarah tried to break free, but it was too late. The mirror shattered, and she was pulled in. Her scream cut short as the glass consumed her. They say that mirrors hold more than just reflections. They hold memories, moments, and sometimes something darker. Sarah's apartment was empty after that night. No trace of her remained, except for the broken mirror, still hanging on the wall. But if you ever find yourself near that apartment, don't look into the glass. Because if you do, you might just see Sarah's reflection. And if she smiles back at you, you might never leave. Now, remember this. Every reflection tells a story. But some stories are better left untold. If you ever feel a chill run down your spine when you look into a mirror, don't ignore it. Because sometimes, the thing staring back at you might not be a reflection at all. There are things we leave behind, old toys, forgotten memories, parts of our past. But some things should never be forgotten. This is the story of a doll that was never meant to be found. A doll that watched, waited, and moved. Are you sure you're alone tonight? Because sometimes the things we think are far away are much closer than we realize. Sit back and listen closely, because this story will make you think twice about the things you keep tucked away. It was just another summer afternoon when Lily, a curious 8-year-old girl, was sent to the attic by her mother. They had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of town, a house that had been empty for years. Lily had heard stories from her mom about how this place had been in their family for generations, but the house always seemed off. The floors creaked, the windows rattled, and the attic? Well, that was a place she was never supposed to go alone. But curiosity got the best of her. Lily, being the adventurous spirit she was, had always been drawn to the forbidden spaces, the areas her mom kept locked, the rooms she wasn't allowed to explore. And on this particular day, the attic was her next mystery to solve. She climbed up the narrow stairs, the air growing colder with every step. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that peeked through the small, grimy window. Boxes piled high, old furniture covered in faded sheets, and then she saw it. A dollar. Old, worn with glassy eyes that seemed far too large for its small porcelain face. There was something strange about that doll. Lily couldn't quite place it. Something unnatural. Its eyes, cold and unblinking, stared at her as if it were alive. She felt an odd shiver crawl up her spine, but she didn't care. She reached for it. The moment her fingers brushed against its frayed dress, she heard a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It came from the doll. Or was it in her head? Lily thinking and hesitating. Just a doll. It's just a doll. But something inside her said it wasn't. Lily didn't know it yet. But that moment, that simple act of touching the doll would change everything. That night, as Lily lay in her bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The room, dimly lit by the faint glow of the moon, felt suffocating. The shadows danced on the walls, stretching and twisting with every breeze that rattled the window. And then it happened. Lily's eyes slowly drifted toward the shelf in her room where she had placed the doll. It sat there as she had left it, with its large glass eyes staring right at her. But wait. Lily blinked. Had the doll moved? It seemed to be facing her now, its cold, lifeless gaze locked with hers. She could feel a strange chill in the air, a heavy presence that made it hard to breathe. She pulled her blankets up over her head, trying to dismiss the feeling, telling herself it was just her imagination. But as the night wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every time she opened her eyes, the doll's eyes were closer, a little closer. She could almost hear it now, a soft whisper that seemed to come from the direction of the doll, like a voice beckoning her to come closer, to listen. But the whisper was faint, barely audible, too faint for anyone but Lily to hear. The next few nights were the same. Every time Lily went to bed, she'd find the doll closer to her. It started at the foot of her bed, then moved a little closer to her pillow. Each night, it crept silently forward, its eyes never leaving her face. And then, on the fifth night, Lily woke to a strange sound, a scraping, a soft but unmistakable sound, as if something was dragging across the floor. She opened her eyes, but the darkness of her room was so thick she couldn't see anything. And then she heard it closer than ever before. The doll was right next to her bed. Its porcelain hands were pressed against the side of her pillow. Its glassy eyes stared into hers, its face twisted in an expression of unholy glee. Lily, whispering and terrified, What do you want from me?" The doll didn't answer, but in that moment, Lily understood. It wasn't just watching her. It was waiting. Lily tried to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, to run, but her body was paralyzed with fear. She could only watch, horrified, as the doll's eyes glowed brighter and its smile twisted impossibly wider. It whispered again, but this time the voice was clear, almost triumphant. "The doll says, 'You should have left me alone.'" The room grew cold, the walls closing in as the doll inched closer still, its eyes never breaking contact. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, but her limbs wouldn't obey. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating, as the doll's cold porcelain fingers brushed against her cheek. In a sudden rush of adrenaline, Lily broke free from her paralysis. She scrambled out of bed and bolted from the room, her heart racing. She ran down the hallway, but when she turned back to see the doll, it was already there at the end of the hall, waiting for her. The doll's eyes shone in the darkness, its smile now a grotesque, unholy grin. The doll echoing, "You'll never escape me, Lily." Lily ran faster, desperate for a way out. But when she reached the front door, it wouldn't open. It was locked. AMD the Lily was trapped. No one ever saw Lily again. The house was abandoned. her parents moving away in search of answers they would never find. But that doll, that cursed doll, it's still there, in the attic, waiting. And if you ever find yourself near an old forgotten house, with an attic that's never quite right, you might just hear that whisper. The doll's voice whispering, "You should have left me alone." So, remember this. Some toys aren't meant to be played with. Some things once forgotten should stay that way. Because if you ever come across a doll that seems to stare just a little too long, take a step back. There are whispers that go unheard, quiet murmurs that hide behind the walls of every house. We think they're just the wind or the house settling, but sometimes, just sometimes, those whispers are more than that. This is a story about a couple who moved into their dream home, only to realize that their walls were more than just walls. They were hiding something or someone, and the whispers were just the beginning. Listen closely. You might hear something you shouldn't. It was supposed to be a fresh start for Sarah and Tom, a beautiful, spacious house on the edge of town. They had been looking for months, and when they found it, everything felt right. The walls were pristine, the floors polished, and the air smelled of new beginnings. But there was something off. As they unpacked, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Every time she stepped into a room, she felt like someone or something was watching her. Tom, however, brushed it off, saying it was just the excitement of moving into a new place. At night, when the house was completely silent, Sarah would hear it. A soft, faint whisper coming from the walls. At first, she thought it was just the house settling. Old houses made strange noises, but the whispers didn't stop. They were constant, whispering in hushed tones as though someone was speaking just out of reach from behind the walls. She told Tom, but he dismissed it. He didn't hear it, he said. Maybe it was the pipes or the wind outside. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house was alive in some way. The walls seemed to breathe. The whispers grew clearer every night. It didn't take long before the whispers weren't just whispers anymore. They started to change. The sound grew louder, more distinct. They started to feel like words, urgent and desperate. Sarah could no longer ignore them. One night, as she lay in bed, the whispers came again. But this time, it wasn't just one voice, it was many. They were overlapping, growing frantic, as if dozens of people were speaking at once. Her breath caught in her throat as she heard one word clearly, "Help." She tried to wake Tom, but he was deep asleep, unbothered by the sounds that rattled the house. He didn't hear anything. But Sarah was awake now, wide-eyed, listening to the growing noise from the walls, as if something or someone was trying to get out. Night after night, the whispers grew louder and more frantic. Tom began to notice the change. The air in the house seemed heavier. The shadows stretched longer, and the whispers seemed to have a rhythm, like a heartbeat behind the walls. And one night, Sarah heard a voice clearer than ever. It came from the bedroom wall, just inches away from her ear. "Let me out." Tom finally acknowledged the whispers. He couldn't deny it anymore. The sounds were real, and so was the fear in Sarah's eyes. They decided to investigate. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a hammer, they started to tear at the walls. The whispers grew louder, echoing in the house as they hammered away, the walls crumbling beneath their hands. They worked in silence, the only sound the rhythmic thumping of the hammer hitting the plaster. It felt like the house was fighting back. Every time they made a crack in the wall, the whispers would rise, louder and more desperate, until the air itself seemed to shake with the sound. Finally, they broke through. What they found wasn't just empty space. Behind the walls, hidden in a small, dark alcove, was something or someone. It was a cramped, suffocating space, just large enough for a person to fit. And inside that space, there was a body. A body that had been there for years. The figure was skeletal, its bones curled in a fetal position, covered in a layer of dust and cobwebs. And on the wall next to it, written in what appeared to be blood, were the words, "I never wanted to die here." The whispers stopped, but the air was thick with something more. The house seemed to groan under the weight of its own secrets. They had uncovered the truth, but it was too late to escape. The walls that had hidden the trapped soul for so long now held a dark presence. And as Sarah and Tom stood there in shock, they could feel it, the cold, creeping touch of something watching them from the dark corners of the house. Just as they turned to leave, the walls began to shake violently this time. The air turned cold, as if the house was breathing with them. A final whisper louder than any before echoed through their ears. "Let me out." But this time, it wasn't from the walls. It was from behind them. Tom turned, but there was nothing behind them. Nothing but the darkness of the house and the broken wall that now revealed its gruesome secret. And yet as they stood frozen, they realized the whispers hadn't stopped. They were coming from inside the house, outside their walls, pulsing from every corner. And then with a sudden crash, the house seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls shattering as something dark, ancient, and hungry began to emerge. Sarah and Tom were never seen again. The house, once a dream home, now sits abandoned, silent. But if you listen closely, even from the outside, you might hear the whispers. They never stopped. And if you listen long enough, you might even hear your name. So, if you ever hear something coming from behind the walls, if you hear a whisper that isn't your own, don't ignore it. Don't assume it's just the house settling, because some whispers are trying to tell you something. Something that you might not want to hear. Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night, unsure how you got there? Imagine waking up to find yourself standing in your backyard, hands covered in dirt, and no memory of how or why you're there. This is the story of Michael, a man who thought his sleepwalking was harmless until the night he discovered the truth about what he was doing. A truth so horrifying he could never go back. Michael was an ordinary man, a quiet, reserved individual living alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town. His days were uneventful, but his routine is simple. But his nights were another story. It started with small things. He would wake up in different parts of his house. The kitchen, the living room, even the front porch. At first he thought nothing of it. Sleepwalking wasn't unusual, he told himself. He even joked about it to his co-workers. But then, the incidents began to escalate. One night, he woke up in the backyard, his bare feet covered in mud. Another, he found himself in the garage, the lights flickering ominously as he held a hammer in his hand. It was unsettling, but not enough to alarm him yet. He set up cameras around his house, curious to see what he was doing during these episodes. What he found was strange but harmless. Him wandering aimlessly, muttering incoherent words. But the footage didn't explain everything. Weeks passed, and Michael's sleepwalking became more frequent and more disturbing. He would find objects in strange places, a knife in the sink, muddy footprints leading from the back door, and once a lock of hair that wasn't his. Then came the whispers. At first he thought they were dreams, soft voices calling his name, urging him to do things he couldn't remember. But they didn't stop when he woke up. The voices followed him, faint but persistent, like an eerie hum at the back of his mind. He tried to ignore them. He even stopped watching the footage, afraid of what he might see. But one night, curiosity got the better of him. What he saw was no longer harmless wandering. The footage showed him standing in the middle of his living room, staring blankly at the camera. His lips moved, but no words came out. And then, without warning, he turned and walked out of frame. When he checked the next clip, his blood ran cold. He was outside, digging. A deep hole in the backyard, his hands moving methodically as though guided by an unseen force. He rushed to the backyard, heart pounding. The hole was there exactly as he'd seen in the video, but it wasn't empty. Inside was a small wooden box, and when he opened it, he wished he hadn't. Inside the box was a collection of items, a blood-stained ribbon, a cracked photo of a smiling family, and a set of keys. They were old, worn, but somehow familiar. He didn't recognize them, but deep down, he felt a chilling connection. As the nights went on, the sleepwalking intensified. He woke up further from home once by the riverbank, his clothes soaked and muddy. Another time, in the woods holding a lantern that wasn't his. The voices were no longer faint. They were shouting, demanding, pushing him to remember something he couldn't grasp. Desperate, Michael turned to the footage again. This time, what he saw wasn't him, at least not entirely. The figure in the video looked like him but moved unnaturally, its head tilted at odd angles, its eyes wide and unblinking. It wasn't muttering anymore, it was speaking clearly. "You can't hide from us, Michael." That night, Michael didn't sleep. He locked every door, turned off every light, and sat in the dark, waiting. But the whispers didn't need light to find him. At midnight, the whispers turned to screams. The walls seemed to shake, the air growing cold. And then he felt it, hands on his shoulders pulling him upright. He wasn't sleepwalking anymore. He was wide awake. But he wasn't in control. He moved to the backyard, his hands gripping the shovel he'd left there. His body worked against him, digging furiously, deeper and deeper, until the earth gave way to something horrible. A body. Decayed, lifeless, but unmistakably familiar. It was him. Michael never woke up again. At least, not fully. He became a shadow of himself, wandering the earth, trapped between sleep and waking, between life and death. And if you ever see someone digging in the dead of night, don't ask questions, because some truths are better left buried. So the next time you wake up somewhere you don't remember going, ask yourself, what did I do last night? Because sometimes the answers lie not in your dreams, but in your nightmares.